Coming up on this episode, Dave Lewis joins us from across the pond, Canada, that is, inside joke, to discuss what shadow IT and security debt mean in today's world. In the security news, Google's cookie encryption drama, Microsoft accused Google of shady antitrust tactics, AI shenanigans, the rejected DEF CON talk and hacking traffic lights, vulnerabilities in Realtek SD card readers, the never-ending debate on quantum computing versus cryptography, backdoors are not secrets, and where we are pushing attackers today. Firmware leakage, more on Windows downgrade and UEFI locks, super nerdy Linux things, EDR is dead, well not really, but more on how we can make it not phone home, bypassing memory scanners, a couple of Bluetooth hacks, and a really awesome article about an IoT zero day that has disappeared from the internet. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Quick question, do your end users always, and I mean always, without exception, work on company-owned devices and IT-approved apps? I didn't think so. So my next question is, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question. Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign-in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at securityweekly.com/1Password. Coming to you from Not Purgatory Studios in not semi-high definition, maybe compliments of Darth Vader himself. This is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 849, being recorded on Wednesday, October 30th, 2024. Larry Pesce is to my left. And we didn't dress up in costume. I ran out of time. I brought a costume, and I didn't.
I'm wearing a costume.
Yeah.
I'm dressed like a homicidal axe maniac.
Oh.
Axe murderer. They look like everybody else.
Yeah. Dressed like. Mr. Bill Swearingen is here with us. Bill, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Back refreshed. I just got back from camping. I'm glad to be back.
Oh, so you were out pitching a tent?
Yeah, pitched that.
Pitching a tent.
Getting that tent pitched took some work, but we got it done.
Nice.
Yeah.
Let's see, quick announcement before we get started. Dive into cybersecurity with Cyber Risk Alliance for exclusive insights into the RSA 2024. Explore executive interviews with industry leaders uncovering visionary perspectives on threats and strategies. Delve into curated articles on trends and innovations. Equipping yourself with essential knowledge for today's cyber landscape. Visit securityweekly.com/RSAC for expert guidance and inspiration on navigating cybersecurity challenges confidently and writing announcements with ChatGPT. Let's see. Today we have with us Mr. Dave Lewis, who is currently the Global Advisory CISO from 1Password, with us today. Dave has done all the things, talked at all the conferences, and even done some podcasts. Dave, welcome to the show.
And I also got to say, man, he's looking really good, too. Sorry,
beard
Dave,
is on point. I was thinking that, too. Beard is on point. Dave.
Yeah, he's coming out looking great. So.
You should have seen it during the pandemic. It was down mid-chest level. It was full on. I could have been a competitor for Larry on the beard front.
Nice.
Dave, I don't think you've been on this. How have you not been on this podcast before?
Not for a lack of trying. There was somebody that kept reaching out to me, and every time she reached out to me, I was in another country on the other side of the planet, and it just never, ever worked out.
Well, I'm glad you can be here today. So now we have to start with the question of how you get your start in information security.
Wow. You want to go all the way back to the beginning?
Let's go all the way back. Yep.
Early 80s, my father brought home one of those luggable computers that looked like a suitcase with the keyboard on the bottom. I can't even remember what it was called. And it had VisiCalc on it. And I would spend hours poring over playing with VisiCalc because I needed a hobby. And it really piqued my curiosity because I kept asking my dad, like, how can I learn this stuff? And he's like, he had no idea. He was in finance. This was not his thing. So I just started poking and prodding away. And then my science teacher at school, he had a computer in the back office, and he let my friend and I go in there and use it in off times. And we figured out that we could duplicate video games, and we started selling them to kids in school. And well, that was the beginning of a long, slippery slope to where I am today.
Little did your teacher know you'd be using the computer for piracy.
I don't think it actually crossed his mind at the time. It was as soon as we figured out you could double side those discs, and we were just going to town.
It's awesome. That's awesome. You know, it's interesting. Everyone has computers today, but it wasn't like that when we were coming up. And I too remember asking neighbors, friends, and teachers, like, "Hey, can I use the computer?" Because we just, now I'm surrounded by computers, but back then it wasn't a thing. So you had to know people.
What I think is funny is back in the day, what we did is we would share pirated material openly, and if you were cool, we would teach you the hacking stuff. And now it's the exact opposit, right? Like I'll teach everyone the hacking stuff, but hey man, we can't.
We can't do the I don't know. Piracy, what's that?
I remember something as simple as just trying to get my hands on a video game. Like some of the kids that I knew had Ataris, and I wanted one so badly. And my parents got me a video game system for Christmas. I was so happy to rip it open, and staring back at me is a ColecoVision. I was like, oh, God damn it. Everybody, I couldn't trade games with anybody. I was like stuck playing Zaxxon and Donkey Kong all the time, but it worked.
Qbert,
yes.
ColecoVision had that like sidecar add-on that could play Atari games.
I was blissfully unaware of that till this exact moment.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Because I had ColecoVision and I had one of those things that you could add on, and then you could put Atari cartridges in.
Now, that would have been good information a long time ago.
Yes. Yes.
No,
and it wasn't really available at the library.
Now there's
video
like
game
whole channels.
magazines.
Yeah, whole channels dedicated to hacking old school, like all the old school video game stuff and all the add-ons and all that stuff. It's pretty fascinating. Dave, tell us about your cybersecurity career. Not that we always called it that, but
wow,
give us a brief overview.
Yeah, so I really got my start when I was in university, because there was a long gap there where I didn't have access to computers. So I went off on a different tangent, getting into music. And I remember that my roommate had a computer, and I got my first computer, and I found out about, BBSs and things like that. So I would be on those. And he got his, and it was way faster than mine. So I jump on it. He goes, "Okay, I'm just going to go to the washroom. I'll be right back." And when he came back, I was looking through the source, or the HTML rather, for FBI.gov. And he freaked out and ripped the computer out of the wall. He's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm just looking at the HTML." He's like, "Don't hack them." So that was where that started. And then I remember the time when I found out that there was actual computer courses, there was a program here in Toronto, Canada, that I signed up for that really was pivotal. I had done a degree in archaeology, go figure, because why not? And then when I found this course, it was either law school or computers, and I realized I had no intention of doing law school. About 5 minutes into writing the LSAT exam, I literally said, "This has changed my mind. Can I get out?" They said, "You have to stay here for the first 2 hours." I said, "Fine." Put my head down on the table, and I started snoring. And I felt bad for the other people because I didn't realize I was a snorer. They hated me by the time I was allowed to go. So I went into computers, and then I found out rather intuitively that I knew how, like, it was based on teams in the course. So each team would be developing their own project, and I would breeze in, check a look at their source code, and pull, their scripts and have a look at it and compare it to Mars. Never really dawning on me that I shouldn't have been doing that. And I think the tipping point was when I was able to download the salaries for all the professors in the school. And I was like, wait a second. And I walked into the administration. I said, "I shouldn't be able to see this, should I?" And I've never seen somebody go so pale so quickly in all my life. But it was really had gone back to those earlier roots and that innate curiosity that really fed things. And then I started at a bank here in Toronto as a rapid application developer. 10 days after I started that job, I muscled my way into the security team, which was only one person for a company of 55,000 employees. Whoa. And it really was a pivotal moment. And they threw all kinds of training at me and things to that effect. And then my next step after that was working for a DoD contractor. Quite by accident, I was on training in Austin, Texas, and there was a young lady ahead of me, and all of our computers were networked, and we just started hacking each other's computers back and forth, and we were leaving notes for each other. And that particular IDS training course had recorded everything on the network. And I only found out about 2 years ago that they actually use that as an example in their training up until very recently. So they had
what not to do in class.
Exactly, or it's just to
do what
illustrate
Dave did,
that we
don't
can
do
see
that.
things. Don't do that. So the two of us just going back, we were making plans like, where do you want to go for dinner? Because the class was very slow and plodding, but so they used that to spice up the class after that.
No, it's great. I love how there's different moments in your career, Dave, where you like tried to go down other paths, but you just kept getting sucked back into hacking. That's
And that really is the truth of it, because I've been in music. I even did sales at one point. And I almost had a job as a gravedigger one year, and a car salesman. That was another one I almost did, because I thought I was going to wash out of university, and my dad's friend got me a job selling cars. And I realized that, no, this is not the way I want to go. So I just knuckled down and did better in school. I was able to squeak out a degree out of that. And then after Royal Bank, after the DOD, I ended up working in critical infrastructure for about 9 years, worked at several banks. And then I slipped into the vendor space, and with Akamai Duo, a company to remain nameless, and now 1Password. And the really awesome thing about 1Password and Duo Security is there was really, both of those companies had a push that was really about being kinder than necessary. That was the mantra at Duo. And the whole idea was, don't be an ass to your customers, your friends, whoever it happens to be. Be better than, be what you would expect to receive in return. And so both of these organizations have left a absolutely indelible mark on me, because I've seen companies on the street that'll do very negative things, negative advertising and things like that, or even getting down to, vilifying the users, which is far too many people do. And to be fair, I did it when I was in the younger part of my career because I didn't know any better. But being able to shift that and have, a better conversation has really been key. And in a way, it's going back to my hacking roots, is like changing the mentality, changing the psychology. Because I took what I learned at Duo and applied it at 1Password, which, to be fair, they were already doing a lot of that. But being able to, further emphasize that really has been a lot of fun, because I can see the net benefit. I can see the impact on younger staff that are just starting out their careers, and they understand that, that it actually can be a good thing.
How early were you in at Duo? Right, so like where were they at when you? Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I was pre-acquisition. But the problem was that Wendy Nather, my former boss there, she tried for 6 months to get me to join. And the problem was while I was at Akamai working for Andy Ellis, I was actually very happy. I absolutely loved my gig there. But one day she said, well, what's it going to take? So I wrote a number on a napkin, pushed it across the table, fully expecting her to tell me to jog on. And she looks at it and she goes, all right, done. And I was like, okay, I guess this is happening.
Good for you, man.
Yeah. I guess I don't work for Akamai anymore. Oh,
no, that was the end of that. And it was really weird to leave a company that I actually thoroughly love my job to go to a company which it was an unknown. I knew a lot of good things, but realizing after I made that transition over to Duo that what a wonderful experience that was. And I was very happy that I was able to make that shift. Obviously, things changed as years went by, but that was no fault of the Duo folks.
It's interesting, Dave. We talk about busting cybersecurity myths. We had Spaff on the show, and when I went to New Jersey, I listened to his book in the car, and he talks about the user aspect. How we were kind of brought up going, the weakest link is the user. And he challenges that notion to be like, no, maybe you're just not doing things the way you're supposed to be doing, and then just blaming it on the user. I think that's interesting how we've evolved as an industry to kind of bust some of those myths that we're.
And there's a lot of truth in that, because fundamentally security is a human issue, and we tend to go, we'll throw a technological solution at it. And like the technological solutions are good, but it's only part and parcel. It's like you can have any hammer you want. It just has to be red, blue, or green. But a lot of times we miss that point. It is a human issue. And when we try to say, here's another phishing simulation, it's like, what is that doing other than hitting the users across the nose with a rolled up newspaper and saying, you did a bad thing? Maybe it's because exactly that we've made a misstep in security that we haven't given the tools to empower them, because we're looking at protecting folks that are in HR and finance, things like that, where they are very good at what they're good at, but security is not their lingua franca. So we have to give it to them in such a way that they can understand, digest it, keep them safe without them having to worry how to configure a SOX proxy or any sort of nonsense like that. And I think that historically we made that misstep as a collective. I know I did, because what I used to do is I'd print out web traffic usage for interns that started at one company I was working at, and I would have the security awareness training, and I'd hand out all of the different awareness trainings, or traffic usage to all the people in the room, but with the names cut off. So nobody knew whose they were getting, and they would look at it and they're like eyeballs bugging out of their head. And I thought that was a nice medium, but again, it's same effect. It was making them feel bad about how they were behaving, when I could have approached that in a much different way. And, lessons learned. But a lot of times, we collectively don't learn that lesson that, security is a human issue, and we have to spend a little bit more time focusing on that and making sure that people feel empowered to ask the questions and do a better job in their own right.
Well, and I think that ties right into shadow IT, which is an overloaded term. And I suppose I want to start with, I think my brain goes to shadow IT means you've got a user or someone in the organization and they bring in a wireless router and they plug it in to solve a problem, right? And,
wow,
and
that's funny. That's not where my brain lands.
Right. I don't know why that's the one that I think of, right? I think of it as phones being a similar thing, but I mean, let's stick to the wireless router thing, because that's very much more of a people thing than it is a technology thing. It means you're not solving their technology problems and they're trying to solve it on their own.
I think of a guy with a credit card who goes to Dropbox.com, right? And like purchases all this cloud, and then they just start using that and putting my corporate data up there, right? Like that to me is almost a little bit scarier.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So use the wireless router example. That was something I lived in one particular high-tech manufacturer, where every Friday, my coworker and I would walk around with laptops doing with a net stumbler or something like that, just sweeping. And we would find these things everywhere and every week into the bin. And at the end of the year, we'd sell them off and give the proceeds to charity. But they would, it was nuts. It would be every week they did it again. But these were very high functioning developers.
Because their wireless router kept disappearing, right? Like, you got to go back.
I got to go get another one now. Where'd it go?
It was nuts. Oh, God. Yeah, no, that happened far too many times. And then there was another example that you pulled out there that I sort of whiffed on.
Oh, the Dropbox example. But it's kind of the same thing. Like, scratching an itch. I need a solution, and I don't have a central way to get that solution, so I'm going to build it on my own.
And a lot of the reason for that is because, people feel that they don't have the support they need to get their job done. So shadow IT is never done out of a sense of malice, or I'd say 99% of the time is not done out of a sense of malice. It's people just trying to get their job done, just trying to innovate. And not always do the organizations they work for support them in a way that is going to be, successful. And like a great example is one bank that I worked at. We did, I think it was like my first couple of weeks on the job. We got the finance to pull the corporate card usage for the entire company. And we were able to track down so many AWS usage things. And they were using production data, and they didn't understand that was a problem. So the problem there was, at no point had we communicated, don't do this. It was just something that happened organically. So we had to, fall on our sword and try to fix that, because a lot of times in a security role, we're like, oh, how could you even think of doing something so daft? Meanwhile, it's like, well, we never told them it was a bad thing.
Yeah, oftentimes I feel like as you increase restrictions, it also increases shadow IT, right? And so how do we strike a balance there, Dave?
That's one of the things where you have to have really good lines of communication and express to the business. It's like, you need to get something done. You have to communicate it with us and have the ability as an organization to be nimble enough to respond in a way that makes sense. Because, if there's
rather quickly too, like, Yeah, don't take months to respond to something. Like, hey, I got a project that's starting next week, and then the requisition is 2-3 months out. You're going to breed shadow IT that way.
Yeah, if your IT team is sitting there talking about upgrading their token ring install, and meanwhile the business unit wants to do Nitro enclaves, yeah, you have a very huge disconnect at that point. So you want to figure out how to be proactive and quick, but also being safe at the same time. So being there to empower the business is really about the core function of what security is. Getting things to be done safely and securely, but making sure that you're not that limiting factor, not that flaming sword of justice saying the answer is no. What language would you like it in? Because that doesn't do anything to improve matters.
So, I think the way that you solve that is by explaining the why behind it, right? Like, hey, here's what I'm worried about, right? Here's why the answer is no to that, right? And so it's not. I don't care that you have wireless access. What I care is that we have an uncontrolled wireless access to my network, right? Like, and explaining that why goes a long way of that. I think that shadow IT. Don't tell them no. Tell them, hey, here's why we can't do it that way or whatever, what. So
and if you don't have that, that talk with people and don't clearly and transparently communicate what the possible issues are, they're going to go off and do really strange things. Sometimes they'll do something incredibly stupid. Like one organization I was at, we got a cease and desist order from, was it MPAA, the Motion Picture Alliance? And we were like, what are you talking about? We went through all the firewall logs, couldn't find anything. And then they gave us a source IP and we're like, hold the phone. We tracked it down. Somebody had built a stub network off an edge router in Asia, and they were using that to siphon down movies on our connection. Oh, needless to say, that was a very unpleasant conversation, but it was a case of, it's like, people had just gone ahead and done it. That was a negative version of a shadow IT type thing because they were doing it just to benefit themselves. But yeah, you got to be able to have that conversation and clearly communicate to folks what your expectations are, and also to listen to what they need in order to get their job done. If they need an environment where they can try stuff, build the airplane while it's flying kind of nonsense, you want to make sure that you're being there to positively execute, so that otherwise they're going to go off and do really interesting things that you never thought possible.
Yeah, and you don't want to disrupt innovation. I've always kind of had this mantra, and I think it stems from my development background, that you don't take away a tool from a developer, even though from an IT and security perspective, you want to standardize as much as possible to make your job easier. But if you start taking tools away from people that are really awesome with them, you're not going to be as innovative, and you're not going to have a good development process, right?
Yeah, we've been saying this on the show for a long time, that security's job is not necessarily that to say no; it's to say yes, but we need to put some guidelines, we need to put some rules, we need to put some guardrails. We need to figure out how we can not stifle innovation but still remain secure.
And I think one of the conversations we have, and Dave, tell me if I'm far off on this, right? Being the CISO representation in the room is, if I give people what they want in terms of, oh, you want to have that tool, you want to have that type of access or whatnot, that means that's fine, but you're not going to have access to this data. Me personally, I'm fine with that. I'm like, I run kind of rogue, with my technology. And I'm like, no, please don't give me access to that stuff. Number one, I don't need it. And number two, is just extra exposure. So it's about kind of chopping up, identity access management, right, in your organization to be successful and limit your exposure.
Well, exactly, yeah. And like, people are going to do what they're going to do. So you want to be able to not only look at your managed devices, but your unmanaged devices as well, and make sure that you have that visibility, that you can see when things are happening. And then rather than vilify them, go to them and say, look, we see that you're working on this particular project on GCP, AWS, whatever it happens to be. How can we bring that in-house and properly support you? As opposed to, you were going to yeet you off the nearest building. It's not going to work out in a good conversation.
Well, I feel like the cloud providers too are just a slight rant, especially when it comes to storage buckets. They lock things down. Like, it's ridiculous how much, like, try and get more access to a storage bucket. You're going to spend some time. Like, And what I fear is happening is like the opposite result than what we wanted. They go, you're admin of the bucket. Like, as I just can't figure out. So like you're admin of the bucket. And that's that happened to me recently. I'm like, I don't really want to be admin of the bucket, but I really need to get these files there. So what do we do?
But we've seen the nonsense happen so many times in the past. I wrote an article for Forbes years ago about S3 buckets as a great example. When you go to set up an S3 bucket, they have in big bold print across the front of the interface, do not make this public unless you absolutely know what you're doing, or something to that, might be paraphrasing. And yet it happens time and again. If you do a quick search on data breaches that were a result of a publicly facing S3 bucket, it's more than zero, which is a painful experience all by itself. Now, those are usually spun up.
But clearly they know what they're doing.
Oh, clearly. Absolutely. The problem is most of the times that these are set up, it's by a developer or somebody in marketing that may not understand the ramifications of what they're actually doing. And yet we get the exact same result.
Well, that's how it was set up in dev and test, right? So that bucket, and so like, got to send it, right?
It's Prod's problem now. And to be fair, over the years, I have never once seen a test environment that was absolutely a duplicate of production ever. And then they're like, they'll promote code into production. It's like, that doesn't work. I'm like, you think? You have completely different hardware. You have different revs of the operating system. It's like, what could possibly go wrong?
But usually the same data.
I caught that reference.
But oftentimes the same data, though. It happens more often than not, because a lot of times the software doesn't work unless it has a good data set, and we're better to get a good data set than production data.
Right?
That's
Generating
a real problem.
Test
Man.
data
That is
hard.
a real problem. Yeah, test data is hard.
It is hard. But the thing is, if something's worth doing, it's worth applying yourself and making sure that it actually happens properly. Because as we've seen in far too many headlines, things go wrong.
So that's why I always like staging. So I had dev and testing where it had test data, and then I treated my staging just like production, security wise, right? But I would put the code in staging first, because inevitably that would flesh out bugs. I'm like, oh, I didn't anticipate data making, code handling that kind of data. And then you go through another round, and then it would end up in production. Easier said than done, though. This is one smallish application. You got enterprises with thousands of applications, so problems at scale.
And I've seen an entire financial institution be brought to its knees over a semicolon in the wrong place in the code, into production, and they were offline for 7 days, or actually 8 days. And you think about the amount of money that goes through internet banking alone on a minute-by-minute basis. It's absolutely staggering how much their losses would have been.
See, they should have done it in Python and not Java, and then they wouldn't have that problem.
Hey, now Java is one of the best remote access platforms ever made.
That's right. I didn't tell Bill, and I was working on the project we were talking about before the show. I totally was like putting code in, and I'm like, why isn't it compiling? I'm like, oh, I need semicolons. I'm like, good Lord. God. I've been coding in Python way too long. Forgot about those. It reminded me of that.
Yeah. Got my tabs right, though.
That's right. The tabs are awesome.
This thing looks great.
Yeah, it looks beautiful.
Yeah.
Love it.
Anything else on Shadow IT? I feel like do we cover the modern versions of Shadow IT? I feel like we covered some historical examples.
One thing that we kind of glossed over real quickly, Dave, is you mentioned getting access to the business cards, right? And that, I got to tell you, so I've been in that position myself, and I've done that myself, and the experience was eye-opening, right? And so I'm just curious, like, how did you do that? How did you get there? And did you make any changes about just how people can use their cards? I think that's a very valuable tool that a lot of times security teams aren't even looking at, right?
Well, that's true.
They're focused on that IDS and not the purchase cards, right?
And that was, about 20 years ago now at this point. But it was a case of we didn't have the visibility. We didn't have good tools in place to be able to actually, see the traffic. And I said, okay, let's try this a different way. And I approached it from the credit card way. And my boss was like, oh, that's awesome. We were actually surprised how many projects we discovered as a result of this, because a lot of the traffic too would be buried in the noise of the regular stuff, so that it wouldn't be easy to pick apart. And that's just it. Is anytime you're trying to solve one of these problems, you have to look at things in a very different fashion, in a non-linear fashion, because you're going to find people are going to do stuff you never imagined. There's so many times it's like, oh yeah, you just put in this tool and everything will be fine. Well, no, because people will do things differently. And that's not a bad thing per se, but getting them to be brought back into the fold in a way that's productive is the challenge. And so looking at the credit cards was just a different way of approaching it. And then we had the conversation with the different business groups. They fell on their sword. They said, yep, we made a mistake. And they helped bring things back into line, which was great. Obviously your mileage will vary, but they understood after having that conversation what the issues were and why it was a troubling thing. So if you come to them and say, look, this is a horrible thing to do, you shouldn't be doing this sort of thing, they're going to just turn tail and run. And they'll do something even weirder next time. If you work with them to make it part of the environment so that they feel supported, it's not easy. It takes work. It takes heavy lifting. But the end result is far more beneficial than ending up on the front page of the Washington Post.
Yeah, for sure. So when I was, so I was CISO of CenturyLink for a while, and who was a DoD contractor as well. And it was shocking. It was absolutely shocking to me what I would find on the expense card. So, the reason why we got there is we went looking for any purchases for Huawei or just any other of those companies that were in that ZTE, those kind of veins, which we ended up finding like GBIC purchases, those kind of things, which just immediately. Hell yeah, that it solved that problem. But what was interesting?
Wait, you mean
to me,
the GBICs on AliExpress aren't the real ones that I should be using?
I wouldn't, not for core networking, right? If you're going to buy a Wi-Fi router and stick it into your company's network, those GBICs are fine if they even need them. But what was really interesting to me was I would also find Slack was a big one. We had a corporate Slack, and yet people would be purchasing, I think we ended up finding, it was like around 20 or something, other Slacks out there, and when we go to those people, they didn't even know we had a corporate Slack. You know what I mean? And so it was really, really interesting to just and I really like the point that you made earlier when you said a lot of most of the time, I'd say 95% of the time, it's not done out of maliciousness. It's not done to bypass this restriction. It's because somebody said, hey, we got to get this, this project needs to get done. How are we going to do it? I know how to do it. It costs $20 on AWS or whatever, and done. There you go. And but the visibility is it's difficult, right? You have to explore interesting ways to find those types of things, I think. So,
oh yeah,
there's an interesting in between there. I'm sorry, I'm just saying there's an interesting in between in what Bill was saying that so I spin up a service on my own because I didn't know that the corporate had that particular service. But there's also I know corporate has that service, but I'm afraid to ask if I can use that service in this specific way, because I'm afraid they're going to restrict what I can do or say no to this particular customization I need. So I'm just going to spin it up on my own and not even bother to ask. But oftentimes if you ask, corporate's like, well, yeah, we can make that. I'd rather have you do it here and have us, have the security controls and visibility than have you go off and do it on your own. So I think that some of the mantra is don't be afraid to ask.
Well, and I'll even add in a little bit there. Don't be afraid to ask, because often when you have other business units leveraging that product, it adds credence to the importance of that product to the company, right? So having other BUs using your, let's just keep saying Slack or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
It shows how important this product is to the company. It's definitely not a negative thing.
Right, because then if they don't see the importance of Slack to the company, they're going to want to use Teams, and that's not good for anyone.
Teams is great. I love Teams.
I'm still mad at Teams for getting rid of the Linux client, but if you
Right.
thought the other clients were crappy,
Oh, jeez.
I used to like Slack's IRC client.
Slack
I remember that.
In the early
I don't remember
early
that.
days, you could use an IRC client with Slack, and I actually enjoyed that because I'm weird that way. And then they took it
Wow.
away. I was like, no, bring it back.
Like Slack is just IRC with pictures.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
If it wasn't for the
100%.
Giphy integration, I don't think anybody would enjoy it.
I'm sorry, what?
Diffie.
Giphy integration?
Giphy.
Jiffy.
It was because you had to, because you used to have to share a URL and IRC, and then people had to click on it, which is like the worst thing because like don't click shit.
Especially from IRC. Don't click shit.
But I mean, what things could happen. I don't know.
We want to talk about security debt. Security debt, Dave.
Well, the security debt is
what
something
about-
I've been ranting
Go
about
ahead.
for a long time. It is a technological debt that manifests as a security issue and the reason this started was at one power company I was working at. We had 7 different monitoring systems. We had several different other types of systems, but it was crazy. It was the logging systems alone, or the monitoring systems alone. There were 7 of them. So we had paid enterprise licenses for all of these. And each time they were put in, it was by a single project that was spun up to do whatever. And they needed that one particular feature. At no point did anyone sat down and tried to consolidate and say, well, would one product do all of these? And I sort of flagged this one. I'm like, we are hemorrhaging cash on maintenance fees, 23 to 25% per annum for each one of these installs. And they were like, oh, hadn't looked at it like that. And then we sat down and found out that, the one solution, I think we went with, I think it was like HP OpenView or something like that. It could do it all. And we were able to, save an absolute fortune there. But this is the kind of thing that, while it's a financial risk for an organization, it's also a security risk too, because about half of these systems were absolutely not been patched in years. In one like the IDS
Dave,
system.
I want to challenge you on that notion a bit because, yeah, you could get one solution that does all those things, but typically it does some of them pretty crappy than the point solutions that did that
That's
thing.
fair.
Right. And I mean, OpenView, maybe as an example, not to pick on HP, but from what I remember,
Yeah, this is
OpenView,
many years ago.
Yeah, it fell into that years ago. It fell into that category of like it did some things really well, but other things it said that it did, but like not great, right? I mean, even you can do that for one vendor, like Cisco Works was the most ironic name of a piece of software. I don't even. Do they still have that? I don't even know. But
I don't actually know. I actually have a couple of CVEs for that one.
Mm.
In that particular one, I found a cross-site scripting issue with it, and I sent it into them, and they fixed it, and they sent me back the fix. And I just happened to have Perilous Proxy open, and it caught something. And I was like, wait a second, what was that? And then I run it again, and I was like, oh, okay. I was actually able to pull a shell back from the system.
Oh,
yeah, through their pat, and I sent it to them, and they to their credit, they fixed it on the spot. But
Nice.
if
I hope you said it works.
it works.
Yeah, right?
Let's ship it. And to their credit, they fixed it right away, and the CVE got pushed out really fast. But that could have been so much worse if just dumb luck I didn't have that thing running.
Oh, so we're talking about debt. Yeah.
Yeah. So with all these systems, yep. So, no, I was just I'm getting ranty. With all these
let's
organizations
do it.
that have these systems that have not been patched to current or N-1, it's introducing all of these issues into the environment that can be complicated by bringing in another piece of software, or heaven forbid, being internet facing, or worse, internally facing to the organization. And if you get somebody that's having a bad day, they can go and cause all sorts of hell. And security theater is another tangent to that. Mm-hmm. One organization I worked at used all the production changes had to be done in this, what they call the KVM room. So, keyboard, video, monitor, or whatever, mouse, sorry. And it was like all these dumb terminals attaching to the production systems. And I remember I went back to my desk after working down there, and I was just so frustrated because there was no windows. It was a stale air room. I just hated it. And I said, these are Windows systems. I wonder if I can do RDP. Sure enough, RDP was enabled on every single one of those systems, and I could do all my production management from my desk. There was
Convenient.
no control. Yeah, it was totally convenient, but there was no control in place. So right there, I became part of the shadow IT problem because I was doing an end run around, what was a policy item as opposed to an actual security control. And they wouldn't believe me when I told them there was no separation. There was no network zone segmentation. They're like, no, of course there is. I had to do a live demo twice to prove it. They thought I was making it up. And that was our ops team.
Yeah, sometimes you got to prove. I've had to be in the prove it category with RDP as well, which is it's
kind of
weird
staggering.
because it's so convenient. It's harder to justify security for it. And RDP is super convenient protocol, and it comes from Microsoft,
Completely.
so it built in. It must be secure, right?
Yeah.
On that very note, that same organization, all the Windows systems in the DMZ actually had full Office installs on them. And I said,
fun.
why? And they said, well, because it's covered under the license. We have it for free. And I'm like, oh my God. So all these internet-facing production systems had full Office suites on them.
Yeah, something to be said about reducing your attack surface is reducing your security debt, and just because you can have it there doesn't mean you should.
And not staying on top of, I know we rant about this all collectively for years, but making sure your systems are patched to current or N-1. And nobody likes to do patching. Nobody likes to look at log files, but this is all essential. We have to get back to those core fundamentals of making sure we're doing the basics well, because this just gives targets of opportunity for the attackers. And then when those systems aren't patched or when there's not proper configuration in place, then along comes ransomware, which is a security debt collector. And boom, you have a much bigger problem that could have been easily solved.
Yeah, so we do this show every week, Dave, every single week, and and what it really comes down to is security fundamentals. I mean, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to exactly as you said, and where I'm at in my career right now is I'm doing a lot of incident response, and I'm doing them for very, very large companies, very, very small companies, and how many times I run into like the O-Day. Just never. Never. It never. It's always. Oh, we were going to retire that system in 2 weeks, or what do you or like, well, what do you mean? My remote workforce has to access RDP to get to the file server, right? Every single.
What do you mean
time,
I should
right?
have landman hashes? What's wrong with landman hashes?
Right, like just every single time, and it's not as sexy to talk about that, but that's really what security needs to be right now. Right now is just hey, fundamentals.
But
man.
I feel like, Dave, that people have there's a general notion in our industry today that reducing security debt means applying patches. I don't think it comes across clearly enough to go reducing security debt is turning things off. It's removing that software, removing that system, reducing complexity, not going, well, this is what I have, so I better apply all those patches, when I get the vulnerability
That's a good point.
scan results.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Yeah, and to
one of the things that,
sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to pick on your example, I actually had about 15 years ago, one company I was working at, we had that marketing website that was going to be retired in 2 weeks. And I said, okay, good, because it was a deprecated version of WordPress. I'm like, you got to take that offline. Thankfully, it wasn't connected to any internal systems, and it got popped by a group called the Root Beer Sec at the time. Needless to say, that was a bad day. I didn't sleep for about 3 days, but it was just a reputational hit as opposed to anything else. But I had to fall on my sword because I never asked them specifically when they were taking it offline. I just said, this is a problem. You need to take it offline. They're like, yeah, sure, we'll get to it. I didn't follow up. And so I own that particular one. But sorry, you were going to say.
Yeah, no, I don't. Actually, what I was going to say is, one of the things that, so I've also, back in my career when I found multiple systems doing the same thing. A lot of times it was SIM or, however you say it. I say SIM like behavior. But how do you classify? And I'm just, I'm curious, like, what you would classify. So another thing that we also would find is that we would have a lot of equipment that weren't being fully utilized. A really good example that we found, and again, I worked at an ISP, and we had big hardware, and we would find these load balancers that were running at 1% CPU or something. They weren't, and they did they had all these functionalities. They had WAF, they had IDS, they had this, that, whatever, and they weren't being utilized for any of that. They were purchased as load balancers, and they're being used as load balancers. Does that come into that conversation at all? And like, how should people think about that?
Did they have big IP on those?
They did. They had big IPs.
IPs were really big. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, no, I mean, and that is part of it too. It's like you're spending all this money to install all these systems. And yes, if it has like 1% utilization, obviously it has the capacity to do other things. And, making sure you're making those right decisions, because like, even if you put it in a cloud context, if you have all these different services that you're using on, say, AWS as an example, you're paying big money if it's not being utilized properly, or you have the potential to. And then it becomes, if the attacker realizes this and launches an attack again, you have what's essentially an economic denial of service. So looking at ways that you can reduce your cost footprint doesn't necessarily just mean patching. You're absolutely right, Paul. It is about, making those right decisions, because there are far too many times where a system is not even configured properly, or you don't have something as simple as network zone segmentation. One company I worked at had a flat network, 16,000 employees spanning the globe, MPLS circuits as far as the eye could see. And I'm just watching Larry reach for his drink. I agree.
Hey, I'm going to need something stronger after this.
Yep, me too.
Oh, yeah. And it's crazy because, I've known you all for many, many years, and I know we've all seen crazy stuff like this. And yet it continues, right? It's like, Shadow IT is one of my favorite ones, because I gave a talk, God, when was it? In June. And I asked the audience, I said, how many people here have policies and technical controls in place to deal with Shadow IT? Everybody put their hand up. I said, oh, okay. And I walked backwards and forward across the stage, pondering it for a second. I looked at the audience and I said, how many people in here have Shadow IT? Every single hand went up. It is Schrodinger's IT security problem. We keep talking about it. Even something as simple as passwords. We give it short shrift. And, that's not a product pitch or any stretch of the imagination, but it is something that is still a problem. It is a control as opposed to a security control, but we need to figure out a better way to do things. I always love to use the example of a house key. You lock your door when you go off to work, go off for the day, whatever it happens to be, your stuff is safe. Unless you lose that key in a coffee shop, on a park bench, whatever it happens to be, and you have, say, a picture of your family on it, or, if lost, send it back to Dave. Then you have a problem, because somebody of a negative intent can take that, go and access your house. Your house doesn't know any better. We have to find ways to do better controls, like MFA, passwordless, FIDO authentication. All of these things are things that are not necessarily in the mainstream at this particular time, but they are close enough to it that we all collectively got to give it a push and find ways that we can do a better job of streamlining security, so that, the people that work in HR, work in finance, don't have to think too hard as about security in general. They can concentrate on their core competencies and know that they are protected. And I think that's one of those things where security can do a better job.
I want to just change gears a moment in the security debt context in development. And this is, I believe, now somewhat controversial. Like, when I talk about this in the show, I think some agree, but some, it really grinds their gears, man.
We get it. You use Arch, right?
No, it's not that. It grinds their gears. Like, they don't agree with me. I even think Sam Bound doesn't agree with this notion, and it stemmed from when I was developing.
I agree with Sam. Wherever you're going with
this,
right.
I agree with Bill's going to take the counterpoint, which is great.
Yellow Dog
I was
Linux,
developing an application, right, and I had just read all the DevOps things. And I was like, I want to reduce security debt, and I want to do it as I go. I want to break work up into smaller chunks, and I want to harden and fix things as I go. So therefore, in my build environment, I'm going to pull in all the new dependencies, right? For the Python application, for the container, whatever's new that's going in my build as I'm developing. If it breaks because something new, a library in the operating system, or a library from Python is new and not compatible with my code, my application breaks, I'm going to fix it then in development. That way, I'm not incurring all of that security debt, where 6 months from now I've got 6 months worth of libraries and Python dependencies to fix. And now I feel like it's a lot more work. And I was like, I want to cut off security vulnerabilities before they happen. And if I'm on a newer version, I can likely increase my chances. And I recommend that people do that as much as they can in application development. And some people agree, but again, some people are like, that's not possible. It does more harm than good. Where do you fall on this particular point, Dave?
I've always erred on the side of caution. And I mean, if there is something that you can do to reduce your risk overall, and it is something that is, feasible to be able to execute upon, then just do it. Because it's like the simple analogy is like you can pay $1 up front or 10,000 on the back end, which is going to be more palatable to use in an organization. And invariably people are like, oh, I'll pay the $1. But yet in practice, we see it time and again. We're like, oh, we'll go fix the problem later. Like WannaCry, my goodness, that particular vulnerability was known for a decade. And then all of a sudden somebody comes along and is like, I'm going to break everything. And they did.
It doesn't just apply to development. I'll bring it to something that's very relevant to our industry today, and that goes to VPNs and network appliances. And we've seen a huge uptick in attacker behavior and activity targeting VPNs, appliances, network devices. And patches come out. I mean, again, we can debate that point, whether we're just putting our fingers in the dike. I think I heard Ryan Nardi in his podcast talk about that we're not really fixing the problem. We're just kind of patching the holes, putting the finger in the dike for now by releasing patches. But the patches are there. But if you're not applying patches to these devices, something super critical comes out, and now you got to go from version 1 to version 12, and something critical is being actively exploited in the wild. Well, now you just put yourself at a significant disadvantage. I've always been of the mindset of patch as you go, stay as current as possible. It sounds like you're on board with that, right? You talked about the patch, N-1, Dave, and but I feel like not a lot of people are adopting this. Not enough people are adopting this, as we see by the numbers. So many hosts are out there on the internet and they're vulnerable.
Yeah, and honestly, that's an economics problem as opposed to a lack of desire to do so. They have organizations of X number of people on staff. They have X number of money or dollars available in order to get things done. And then it becomes just like, all right, which is the priority here? What is the likelihood that we're going to get popped through our appliance? Like I remember when I put in the first,
because it was supposed to be easier to maintain, right? It was supposed to reduce some of our security responsibility.
But you still need to do the care and feeding. I remember the first Nokia SSL VPN I put in, years and years ago. And it was like I brought fire to the village.
Was that a IP410 or something like that? IPSO? Yeah, I remember those.
Something that, And I had set it up where it was supposed to be geared up so I could be able to get everybody in the company. At that time was like 500 people for this power company to be able to use it in a moment's notice so we could just gear it up. And sure enough, we had SARS outbreak, and all of a sudden everybody had to work from home. And up until that point, everybody fought me on this. They're like, we don't need that. We can just use the other product, which was a VPN terminator that the IT architect bought on eBay. I'm not actually making that up. So when everything did go sideways, all of a sudden this device was sprung to life and it was able to, manage everything. And I had, VRRP set up. So it was like seamless failover, all the rest of it. But a lot of times it really is the economics question is like, do they have the tools they need in order to support it? Like the really good security practices will probably have 6% of the IT budget overall. And that's not a lot. And that only goes so far. And I remember one company I had a great budget. I was able to do everything for the year. That was like the beginning of January. By January 16th, they had clawed it all back and gave it all to engineering. So all of a sudden, I had just enough to do the lather, rinse, repeat of the maintenance licenses.
But there's also a responsibility on the vendor to give us something that's more secure what they're giving us today.
100%. I remember the first IDS system I ever rolled out. It was the Wheel Group, NetRanger.
Yeah.
And I set that up. And I was so happy with it. And I looked at the VAR that had put it in for us. And I said, okay, how do we get updates? And he goes, what are you talking about? What do you mean? What am I talking about? And he's like, how are you gonna update the signatures? And he's like, oh, well, you already got the signatures pre-canned. I'm like, what about new attacks? And just watching his face contort as he had not actually considered any of this, even though it was in the documentation that we had agreed upon. But yeah.
And that eventually would become Cisco NetRanger.
Yes, it would actually. That was to give you an example of how long ago that was. And that's just the thing. It's like when you look at stuff like Shadow IT, when you look at stuff like security debt, these are all things that are imminently manageable. The problem is these are the kind of things that contribute to stuff like black swan events that we see. Nassim Taleb's book is a great example of something to read, where something of huge material impact happens, but in hindsight, it was easily fixed. And we're sitting on so many of these, ostensibly landmines that we can remedy. We do have the capacity, but we have to be able to, make sure that organizations have the resources, have the tools they need in order to help mitigate these potential issues in the future.
Well, because a lot of those bad things haven't happened yet, and we won't address it until they do, which is, I think,
Sadly,
what
yes.
we've always been advocating for is like, can we fix that stuff before something bad happens? But again, you have to justify the resources.
They will. When we've been having the same conversation for 30 years, or at least I have. And I look at a book. There's a book called Outlive where it talks about looking at your medical and how you're taking care of your health. And it's no rocket surgery, nothing like that. But when you string it all together, it's like, oh wait, this actually is a good roadmap. This makes sense. Taking that same mentality, applying it to cybersecurity in general, and go, wait a second, we have all the parts. We look at jurisprudence, we look at legal. They have years and years, centuries of canon where they've learned those lessons. We really collectively stink at learning those lessons, or at least enshrining them in doctrine, so that younger folks coming into the organizations, the industry, will know not to make those same mistakes.
Let's talk about 1Password for a moment. What brought you to 1Password, Dave?
Well, you had a cocktail napkin, and
that was Duo Security. That was Duo Security. With 1Password, there's quite a few ex-Duo people here. And when I was given my complimentary cigarette and blindfold from my previous organization, they reached out and they said, we're actually looking to hire exactly a person that does your role. So it was absolutely fortuitous. And one of the best things I did was I announced on LinkedIn saying, this has happened. I'm going to be looking for a job. And the amount of support that I got from the community was staggering and humbling. And I do thank everyone out there that actually reached out to me during that time, because that was tough, to go from a high performing organization where we were good for hundreds of millions in ARR pipeline to being told that your role is no longer needed because we have to save money. And it's like, what? Suffice it to say, I was less than enamored to that entire situation. But 1Password, it's the culture, it's the driving force. Like, it's gone from a B2C to a B2B as of RSA last year. And the potential to grow there is unbelievable. And it's just, everybody just rolls up their sleeves and gets it done. There's no little camps of, I don't want to do X. They're like, how can we help? Which is a lot of the same DNA that I experienced when I was at Duo. And everybody, if I had a problem, I could just reach out to Doug Song or John Oberheid or even somebody in help desk, and I would get the same level of response from all of them. And to be able to see that exact sort of mentality in this organization is really, really heartening, because, I want to be part of something that grows, and, hopefully one day we'll go public, and be able to be part of that experience, to see an organization grow into an enterprise security player that I believe that it is going to be.
Yeah, great companies have great culture, and that gets harder and harder as the company grows. Kind of goes without saying, right? Being able to preserve it up to a certain size is harder, but it's super important.
Categorically. Again, security is a human issue.
So, Dave, we just have 5 questions left for you. You ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Let's go.
3 words to describe yourself.
Brutish, short, no hugs. No, that's 4. Oh, well, close enough.
Close enough.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Oh, a souffle.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Wrong. Do it again.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Oh, Hackers.
Yeah, we're on a roll. Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Oh, 2 celebrities to be Anthony Hopkins.
Oh.
And the second one is Helen Mirren.
Fantastic. Dave Lewis, thanks for joining us on Paul's Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
Finally.
finally having you on Paul Security Weekly. With that, we'll take a short commercial break. Come back with the security news. Stay tuned.